Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be listening from around the world, Politics Plus Media 101 family. We have a very special episode for you in store today, the day of elections here in the United States for all of the members of the U.S. House of Representatives and some select and very important Senate seats. As everybody knows, the outcome of today will shape and largely determine the last 2 years of President Biden's first term in office and also the policy coming out of Congress during these 2 years. So today we have a very special episode in that we have the best political reporter from the state of Georgia on our show, Greg Bluestein. He reports for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He's also an MSNBC contributor, and he's author of Flipped: How the Peach State Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. We recommend you go and read that book. Go and buy that book on the link below in our description for this podcast episode if you are interested in Georgia politics at all. Today, we will be doing a deep dive into the race for the U.S. Senate seat that is up between Senator Raphael Warnock and former football superstar Herschel. We will also get into the race for governor between sitting governor of Georgia, Kemp, and Stacey Abrams, a national figure in the Democratic Party. So please strap in, listen along, and try and get ready for a wild evening tonight as the returns for the elections start to come in. Welcome, Greg, to Politics Plus Media 101. The last time we spoke, I believe it was in the wintertime before your book came out. And folks, he is author of Flipped: How Georgia Turned Purple. This is out election day, Tuesday morning, 5 a.m. Eastern. So we have a lot to get into. It's going to be everything Georgia. Usually we get into the meat and potatoes and then we ask for predictions. But Greg, I want to start out early with the difficult questions of poll analysis and predictions. So specifically, there was a college football poll that came out that had the University of Tennessee ranked ahead of Georgia. So is that poll accurate, and will Georgia repeat?
We call that rat poison. You probably do too. Hopefully, by the time this comes out, the game will be over. So I don't know. This is being taped a couple days before the game. I'm going to that game, so I hope it's wrong, and I hope that after the Georgia-Tennessee game, Georgia will leapfrog Tennessee in the rankings. But yeah, I think hopefully if it did anything, it motivated the Bulldogs to play even more fiercely on that big Saturday, the biggest home game in Sanford Stadium history.
It's funny. My brother is actually an alumnus of the University of Georgia, but I never got to go to one of the games in that stadium. So maybe sometime in the future. Yeah,
just don't pick that game because tickets are going for $1,000 plus. I mean, it really is the biggest. Wow. 1 versus 2, or I guess if you look at those rankings, 2 versus 3. But either way, it's the highest ranked game in home game in history. It's not the most important game in history, of course, but it's the highest ranked game at Sanford Stadium. So Athens is going to be a madhouse, and expect Herschel Walker has a campaign event there over that weekend, and all sorts of big campaign events will be coinciding with the game.
It's like 10 times as much as I paid for a ticket for the World Cup in Qatar. So, Greg, one thing that we've done as we've got into each of these kind of state deep dives is we've had our expert on the state explain to us a little bit about the unique political characteristics of a state. What are the demographic trends in the state that make it distinct? What are the major industries in the state that make it distinct? Could you paint for us a political profile of the state of Georgia?
Yeah, sure. Georgia has about 11 million people. It's growing very fast. Many of the people who are moving here are moving from left-leaning states, so that gives Democrats some encouragement throughout the rest of the decade that the state will continue to be blue, or at least turn bluer, I guess is the word, or become more politically competitive. It is a state where, just like other states, there's a rural, suburban, urban divide. Rural areas tend to be overwhelmingly Republican, but there are majority Black rural areas that have been Democratic strongholds over the years. The exurban areas are also overwhelmingly Republican, but Democrats are making some inroads in those areas. And when I say inroads, I mean, instead of Republicans winning some of these exurban areas by 50 points, they might win by 40 points. So, and same thing with these rural areas. And then the suburbs, especially where I live, up in the little ribbon between northwest Atlanta, Cobb County to northeast Atlanta, DeKalb County, and that area used to be, some of the most solid Republican ground in the South, really, and the sort of launching pad for a number of political leaders like Johnny Isaacson, like Newt Gingrich, like Tom Price. And in the last 4 or 5 years, 6 years, it has become not just Democratic, but the cornerstone of the Democratic coalition. Democrats flipped those areas in Cobb County and Gwinnett County in 2016 and just built on their leads in 2018 and 2020. And now I think it's probably one of the most important battlegrounds in the state because Governor Kemp basically sidestepped those areas in 2018. He had TV ads there and, he had surrogates there, but he didn't spend much time campaigning in those areas or focusing on those areas in favor of a rural centric strategy. And now he's trying to expand the battleground map. When it comes to industry, agriculture and tourism, agriculture is our number one industry. Tourism's up there as well. Agriculture is still the king in Georgia. I think people in Metro Atlanta kind of forget that because there's so many Fortune 500 companies based in the city and the suburbs. But agriculture is the dominant industry. And especially once you get outside Metro Atlanta, that becomes very, very clear. And then, of course, Atlanta is home to a number of Fortune 500 companies and big, large employers, Coca-Cola, Home Depot, Delta, a number of other up-and-coming industries. The fintech industry is huge. The insurance industry is huge in Metro Atlanta, and the logistics industry, because we have the world's busiest airport, because we have companies like UPS and Delta based here. There's no way that the logistics industry can't be sort of paramount in the corporate totem pole.
And Greg, speaking of major industries in Georgia, the entertainment industry has also started focusing more in Georgia. Disney are doing so many of their major productions, the Marvel movies there. There's a lot of television being filmed there. And it's funny, you were talking about how people from other states in the U.S., often left-leaning states, have moved to Georgia. One of the reasons they're doing so is because of the creative industry growth. And looking at the results in the 2020 election, we see the margin is only 12,000 votes. And with a margin like that, you can point to almost anything and say, this was one of the deciding factors, because anything is. Could we look at that margin of 12,000 and say, Georgia voted blue because the entertainment industry is focusing on Georgia, because Hollywood is making movies and television in Georgia?
Yeah, you're exactly right. You could say it's kind of anything. You could say any little, a little super PAC that spent $500,000 in Georgia in the last days could say, hey, we're the reason why. But you're right. The film industry is booming in Georgia. And it's a result, actually, of the first Republican governor in state history, or since Reconstruction, I should say, Sonny Perdue, sort of pioneered this film tax credit, and then it expanded under Nathan Deal and became a point of concern in the first year of Governor Kemp's administration, because after he signed into law an anti-abortion limit that the film industry widely opposed, there was a lot of concerns that Hollywood would basically boycott Georgia. We have not seen that yet. Instead, we've seen more growth of the industry, more studios are setting stakes here. And the political leaders, Stacey, Abrams, and Governor Kemp have both sent signals saying the film tax credit is not going anywhere. And that's why you're seeing companies, not just, film productions here, but build these giant, enormous studios, build sound stages, build film academies to train Georgians on how to do this work, so that they're not just flying in folks from California, New York, and elsewhere to do this work. But you're right. There's 90,000 or so jobs created by the film industry, according to estimates. And, some of those are direct jobs like gaffers and cameramen and all that. But some of these are spin-off jobs in the hotel business, in the retail business, and food. And it has been a huge boost to Georgia's economy. And every so often, Republicans will kind of point out what you just pointed out, which is a lot of these outsiders are coming from California, and they rumble about cutting back the film tax.
So last time we spoke, there was a big uproar over voting rights in Georgia, and we had the MLB boycott the All-Star game, receive condemnation from Stacey Abrams and the Republicans. You had Delta come under attack by state lawmakers that you explained to us. And you just referenced there was going to be fear about this tax credit if corporations like Hollywood spoke out about I believe it's a 6-week abortion ban in Georgia. So have we not seen a corporate outcry like we did for the voting rights? And Can we attribute this to the original actions by the GOP to really crack down with an iron fist?
And you mean a corporate outcry over the abortion law, or
sorry, over the abortion law?
It was really interesting to us because you're exactly right. We saw corporate backlash over a number of major issues in Georgia. There was a religious liberty bill that a lot of critics saw as discriminatory, particularly toward the LGBTQ community. And a number of companies inside Georgia and outside of Georgia opposed that. A number of large companies pushed for basically a transportation tax, a new tax that would fund repairs to Georgia's infrastructure. And then, of course, a number of companies came out against different voting rights legislation and other legislation they saw as bad to the state's reputation. But when it came to abortion, just like we saw in other places around the country, in other states that were passing abortion limits, corporate executives were fairly quiet. I mean, we got no comments or just no answers from a lot of companies when we kind of polled them on the abortion limits back in 2019. And chambers of commerce and other business leaders kind of said, hey, this is a very divisive issue, and we've got people in our boardrooms who are on both sides of it. It was not sort of an issue where there is a broad consensus over abortion limits, or at least if there wasn't a broad consensus, there wasn't an urge from a lot of these businesses to dip a toe into these political waters. So they stayed out of the debate, really. It wasn't like the opponents of these new abortion limits didn't have plenty of other folks who were raising criticism and critiques about that bill, but the corporate community largely stayed on the sidelines. And I think you've seen that in other places around the nation where big companies kind of steer clear. But in Georgia, it was really unique because we also had governors of California, of New Jersey, of North Carolina, and other states where you had Democratic leaders basically make a play for Georgia jobs. The governor of New Jersey wrote a letter to Georgia CEOs, a few of them, saying, hey, consider expanding to New Jersey where we preserve abortion rights. And we've expanded Medicaid and we have a lower cost of healthcare. And of course, Georgia responds to that saying, hey, we've got lower taxes and a better economic climate. So it got a little war of words with New Jersey after that.
And this was when hiring was very difficult. It's starting to cool down a little bit due to the state of the economy and how hot everything was. So let's follow up there and get into how the different candidates are approaching abortion. So we know what's happening on the Republican side with Kemp signing the law and defending it, and Herschel Walker going viral with these clips and scandals, which we can get into later. But how are Stacey Abrams and Senator Warnock approaching this? Are they approaching it similarly, or is Stacey Abrams emphasizing it more strongly, more passionately, especially in the closing of the race here? Because right now there is a 6-week ban, and that's something she can materially change if she was elected, theoretically, at least.
First of all, on the Republican side, there is a little difference. Herschel Walker supports an outright ban on all abortions, including in cases of rape, incest, or even when the life of the mother is at stake. Whereas Governor Kemp, he personally supports more stringent limits, but he signed into law a measure that bans abortions as soon as a fetal heartbeat can be detected, which is in most cases as early as 6 weeks, which is sooner than many women even know they're pregnant. But it also has exceptions for rape, incest, or when the life of the woman is at stake. On the Democratic side, Stacey Abrams, I asked her at first early, I think a few months, after the Supreme Court decision sort of leaked by Politico, I asked her thoughts on where, if at all, if anywhere, would she set a limit on abortion? And she wouldn't answer at first. And then after a few more weeks, she decided that she wanted to stake out a position on this. And she said, basically, the limit on abortion should be viability. It's not a specific timeline in her mind. It's not 16 weeks or 15 or whatever, because scientific standards change, as she said. And so she believes that limit should be at viability whenever a doctor or whenever the scientific experts place that threshold. Now, when I asked Senator Warnock the same exact question, the same day as Stacey Abrams staked her position, he said, I'm not going to get into that. He basically dodged the question and said that the focus should be on outrage towards the Supreme Court's decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. So he has not been willing to stake out that opinion. And if he has since then, I've missed it. But it also hasn't really become a major pivot point in that campaign.
Greg, I want to ask you another question about how Senator Warnock is approaching the issues. We've seen from the polls that Warnock is holding quite strong in a challenging environment for Democrats in a competitive state. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why. There's lots of reasons why. But one thing that we've noticed nationally is that Democrats are having a difficult time explaining inflation in the economy and coming up with a message that's clear to voters and compelling. And I wanted to ask how Warnock is approaching that particular issue.
Yeah, it's a good question because you've got Herschel Walker and other Republicans basically saying Biden, inflation, that Democrats aren't doing enough to tackle inflation and that once they get in office, it'll disappear. And Senator Warnock's argument is basically he points to things he's done. And remember, of course, his victory along with John Ossoff's flipped control of the U.S. Senate and allowed President Biden's agenda to go forward. So he points to measures that if he wasn't in the Senate would not have passed, like the American the coronavirus relief funding that passed in early 2021, and what Democrats call the Inflation Reduction Act. In particular, he talks about efforts to cap the price of insulin at $35 and to bring down prescription drug costs. He's trying to take it at more of a micro level than a macro level. When he talks about rising prices, he talks about what he's done to bring down drug costs and other concerns, rather than addressing or at least focusing his message more globally on all of inflation. Although he does tout that measure, which of course some economists say will end up bringing down inflation in the long run. Republicans call it basically another example of overspending.
So this is an issue that goes more towards the governor's race. And just having somebody in the state like yourself, going to the Obama rally, hosting a debate, going to the Abrams rally, you really have your finger on the pulse here. We spoke about the Purdue-Kemp primary in Buckhead becoming an issue with potentially dividing Purdue and Kemp because the whiter, wealthier area, Buckhead, some in the area wanted to leave Atlanta, which is, not as affluent and Black area predominantly. Has this issue come up in the general election between Abrams and Kemp, or was this primarily a virtue signaling between Republicans?
Yeah, this was a wedge issue for Republicans earlier this year. You had this figure who led this Buckhead movement, who is very close to Donald Trump, but not necessarily very deeply tied into the community. And he did a number of controversial things that really ticked off Republicans in the state, because at first it seemed like it could gain some traction. And then he did a number of things, including spreading conspiracy theories. And frankly, he kind of backed the wrong horse. David Perdue, the former U.S. senator who was challenging Governor Kemp, immediately took on Buckhead cityhood as a wedge. And somehow, Republicans basically who are allied with David Perdue got Donald Trump to endorse it as well. So it became this sort of wedge issue within the primary for the governor's race, because Governor Kemp is pretty conservative. I mean, it's hard to paint him as some moderate, but David Perdue would take issues to his right, and this is one of them. Governor Kemp never ruled out a Buckhead cityhood. He just said, hey, I want to see some changes with the city of Atlanta. He didn't want to take a stand either way on it, frankly, and part of that was to continue to appeal to Buckhead donors so that folks on both sides of the issue could give him some money. But within the Capitol, it was looked at as a really a risky effort to basically de-annex part of a city and create a new city with no real plan to do so, and with a very questionable leader of that position. So it has not come up. Stacey Abrams is against it. Governor Kemp has a very good, I'd say solid relationship with the new mayor of Atlanta, Andre Dickens. There's been a reset. He had a poor relationship with the former mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms. So one of the first things Andre Dickens did after he was elected mayor, within hours, is he called Governor Kemp and he called legislative leaders to get off on the right foot with them. And he's kind of pledged, hey, I'm making reforms within the city police department, because the main issue driving this whole Buckhead cityhood has been crime. And so he's saying, hey, I'm making reforms. I'm hiring new officers. I'm making good on my pledge to beef up on security and public safety. And so the line from Kemp and his aides and his allies has essentially been give the city some time to make those changes, and then we'll come back to and we'll see how it's going.
Greg, you mentioned Mayor Bottoms of Atlanta, and it's interesting because we did hear her name in the national media, and it was often in the context of rumor mongering that she was being considered for President Biden's Veep slot, that she was on a short list to be vice president. And it was kind of funny, the whole process of Biden administration appointments, because the people that were being rumored to be getting jobs were never the people that eventually got them. That was true across all the cabinet offices. Washington Post, Politico, they had lists of who's probably going to get the cabinet jobs. And they were 0 for 15, 0 for 20. No one who was predicted to get the jobs was. And we kind of got the feeling that it might have been people on the side of those figures who, wanted to elevate their profile a little bit and were putting things out in the media that, I'm on this list, I'm on that list. And you're, the most connected and informed person in the world of Georgia politics. Can you tell us if there was any truth to the rumor that Bottoms was on Biden's list? Do you know if she was?
Yeah, Bottoms' ally said that she was being vetted, but we always saw it as, that she might have been in like the second tier. We never heard that it got to the point where it was getting very, very serious. But look, there was good reason for her to be kind of named in there. She was one of Joe Biden's first and very important surrogates in the South. She's the mayor of the largest city in the South. And she came to his aid. She endorsed him at a very important time in his campaign after a really rough debate where he and actually Senator Kamala Harris went after each other when it came to their stance on busing in the post-segregation school era. And right after that really rough debate, Keisha Lance Bottoms comes out and endorses Joe Biden, and it kind of helped change the conversation. Fast forward a little bit, Joe Biden holds one of his first fundraisers in office for Keisha Lance Bottoms. And a few months later, she announces that, hey, she's not running for re-election. It stunned a lot of people here in Atlanta. I had heard signals of that. I wasn't completely taken aback by it. I wasn't completely caught off guard, but it still was a stunning move when the mayor of Atlanta decided not to run for another term. She said she could have won, but she didn't want to. She had lost her sort of zest for the campaign trail. And so now she is a member of the Biden administration. She's one of his special White House advisors. But you're right. There is a lot of rumors about her even before that she would become an ambassador to some cool foreign country. And, all this stuff was swirling around. But look, there's another Georgia Democrat who was also at least vetted for that job, and that was Stacey Abrams.
I remember during the 2016 campaign, as part of the RNC, we did a lot of vetting of these candidates. And, there was a clear tier one. You're involved in the campaign, the surrogates, you can listen to the people that you're being told to vet. And then some of the candidates, like, for example, Admiral Stavridis, who was high on Clinton's potential lists. He was the former dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. When we were told to vet him, I think it was for DOD or state or VP. It was a very high. Our eyes almost rolled out of our heads because we knew that this is something that was going to be leaked to the media. So it's kind of the game, right, Greg?
Yeah. There's things that candidates and operatives do on purpose, even if they're not directly involved, to get those. And look, it burnishes your reputation. I guarantee you, if Governor Kemp wins this election today, that he will be mentioned as running mate for in White House conversations in 2024. That doesn't mean he's remotely interested in it. I would wager he's not, but that will come out. And then of course, there'll be all sorts of talk about if Senator Warnock ends up hanging on and defeating Herschel Walker, there'll be all sorts of talk about him being a potential White House contender down the road. And, John Ossoff, he doesn't have to worry about another election until 2026, but his name is going to be firmly in that world in the next decade or so as well, in terms of White House potential.
That's why people real quick should buy your book, Flipped, the story of how Georgia turned purple. But
amen.
I did really want to quickly follow up because we hit on crime. And as a issue, it's really been inflation, abortion, and crime across the nation. I'm not sure if it's broken out that way in Georgia. But what we've been seeing in a lot of these other swing states is it's easier to hit Democrats for crime because the governor is blue. And the senators that are running, the Republicans are tying them to Biden and an increase in crime nationally, regardless of how the statistics work out. How is this dynamic playing out in Georgia. You mentioned Kemp leaning into protecting maybe even a Democrat mayor in Atlanta, but how specifically is Kemp, but Walker also approaching it?
Yeah, it's a blame game, right? You've got Governor Kemp blaming federal policies and sometimes local policies for high crime. Stacey Abrams blames the governor's permissive gun policy for leading to more gun violence. And it hasn't come up as much. I mean, of course, there's an issue in the U.S. Senate race, but it hasn't come up as much in other than your kind of vague arguments. Herschel Walker says Democrats want to defund the police, right? Democrats say they don't. So that's become, but Herschel Walker, Senator Warnock hasn't come out with all sorts of anti-crime policies because it's not as much of a federal issue, at least in this race, as it is a state issue. And there are a number of back and forth because Stacey Abrams was on CNN and she at least indicated that she understood and empathized with the defund the police movement in an interview that is being played all over the airwaves, at least in the first months of the campaign here. She had clarified her position and said she doesn't support defunding the police, and she actually wants to raise police salaries for certain law enforcement officers. But Governor Kemp has continually pointed to not only that interview with CNN, but also her role on the boards of different organizations, including one that advocated for the defund the police movement. So, just like in 2020, it plagued Democratic candidates, it has continued to plague her Stacey Abrams in 2022.
It seems like all you need is one clip or one board membership. And from your discussion with voters, is that resonating with them? Are these attacks landing on specifically the defund the police issue, which, Greg, as you know, has been a big issue for years now?
Yeah, I don't know if it's resonating. I think doing different parts of the campaign, it became a bigger issue for Governor Kemp, and Stacey Abrams felt like she needed to defend herself from it. Right now, though, I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier, which is the economy is the paramount issue for so many voters in Georgia. Democrats and Republicans both acknowledge that. It's not like Democrats are caught blind by that and are only talking about abortion or guns or other issues they think will help them. They have leaned into economic arguments really for the last 4 or 5 months. It's not their only argument, but they certainly have recognized that the economy is paramount to so many Georgians.
So, Greg, I have a political question for you about Governor Kemp. We've obviously noticed that Kemp is running way ahead of the U.S. Senate nominee Walker. He's got quite an opening, big lead in the governor race. He's widely expected to win. This is despite, or perhaps because, of all of the public antagonism between him and the former president, Donald Trump. It's kind of interesting dynamic because so often there's this built-in assumption among a lot of our media class that Trump is this political bulldozer. And, his support has been instrumental for victory of so many of these candidates. But when we look at Kemp, we're seeing that it's possible that his antagonism with Trump is actually helping him. We saw that Raffensperger did so well in his primary. And now Kemp, despite his public fights with Trump, is way ahead of the other GOP nominees. Do you think that, strangely, or perhaps not so strangely, the fights between Trump and Kemp are actually really beneficial to Kemp?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, few people know how important Trump's endorsement can be than Governor Kemp, because back in 2018, he was slightly ahead in a runoff against then Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle. But then 6 days before the election, the runoff, Donald Trump endorsed him, and like the switch flipped, and suddenly Governor Kemp was not just 4 or 5 points ahead in these polls, but he was 20 points ahead, and he ended up demolishing Casey Cagle and won all but 2 of Georgia's 159 counties. Fast forward, to 2022, where you come into this election, you come into this campaign cycle, still thinking that in the Republican world, Donald Trump's endorsement is this golden ticket, and Brian Kemp is literally getting booed at Republican gatherings because Trump is blaming him for his defeat, and here in Georgia, falsely blaming him for his defeat, saying that Kemp should have called a special session to overturn the election results. And there was a number of MAGA activists who fed into that and booed him and made it very clear that he would be in trouble. And there was even Kemp allies who were worried that he wouldn't even qualify for re-election, let alone defeat former U.S. Senator David Perdue, who was this Trump-backed challenger. David Perdue, the entire campaign, said, "I'm doing this to unite the party against Stacey Abrams." Stacey Abrams was the goal here. And he did that, but he turned out he united the party behind Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp defeated David Perdue with 52 point margin, huge. And you're right, because one of the things he did by defeating David Perdue is because David Perdue was so far right. He was bending over backwards to placate Donald Trump. He was promoting all sorts of election fraud lies. He was doing things you don't see legitimate statewide candidates do. Not only that, I mean, he was promoting Buckhead cityhood. He was denigrating and dismissing the biggest economic development project in Georgia history because it cost, it took the biggest incentive package in Georgia history to land it. He was saying he would have rejected that. So he was taking all these stands that didn't fit in with who David Perdue had been in the previous 6 years in office and doing his 2014 campaign. That made Brian Kemp more appetizing, more appealing to that really small but important block of kind of centrist voters who show that they can vote for a Democrat or a Republican. And many of them live in the North Atlanta suburbs. Many of them are college educated, tend to be more affluent. They're the swing voters who were turned off by Donald Trump. And suddenly in those voters, you saw suddenly Brian Kemp became an alternate route, right? For the first time, really, for some of them at least, Brian Kemp became more appealing because he wasn't David Perdue. And now after the May primary, instead of kind of limping to a general, like some of Governor Kemp's supporters feared he would be, it would be this brutal battle and he'd come up on top, but he would be weakened by David Perdue. Instead of that, he comes out of it with a hoard of cash, with a 52-point victory over David Perdue. And frankly, with a message that he promoted throughout the primary of not attacking David Perdue, but attacking Stacey Abrams the entire time. So he never really shifted that message. He still had a general election message even through that really brutal primary. And so David Perdue might have ended up helping Brian Kemp a lot more than he hurt him.
And that really is astounding because we spoke to Eric Erickson during this bloody campaign, and his biggest threat, or fear rather, as a partisan Republican, was that it would bloody them and leave somebody hobbling into a matchup with Stacey Abrams, who, as we all know, has really big national name recognition, largely from her efforts to register voters in Georgia and help flip the state in 2020 for both Warnock and Ossoff. She's reached mythic proportions. I have friends who are not in politics in California texting me, Justin, what's going to happen in Georgia? And first off, it's ridiculous for these national commentators to act like they know what's going on in a state when they're not following the campaigns on every day. So I can imagine that really frustrates you when you hear these armchair political analysts. But I wanted to get into who else helped register these voters in Georgia, because from our perspective on the outside here in Washington, D.C., John's in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it doesn't appear that maybe Stacey Abrams is getting the bump that one would expect from the mythic stature that she now has.
Okay, so first, you are right. She has this sort of titanic figure in national politics, and it's hard won, right? It's a hard won recognition, because even in Georgia, even in the run up to her 2018 run, she was not this well-known figure. And I remember covering one of her first speeches as she prepared to run for governor. And I'd known her for years at that point. I'd covered countless committees where I saw her shape and influence legislation, and had heard lots of floor speeches on the floor of the Georgia House, but never really heard her give a fiery speech. And I was wondering, even I was wondering, could she do this? And she did, right? I mean, she's an introvert by nature, but she forced herself to be extroverted when it came to running for office. And she became this national figure. And it's really fascinating watching it from the ground level, because I'd go to, cover events and I'd be the only reporter there, many of them, or there'd be one other, radio reporter or TV reporter at these events. And she'd joke, Bluestein, we might as well have this in your office. And then fast forward a few months into like the thick of the general election campaign, I'd be up with her in the middle of nowhere in North Georgia, a small little mountain town. And a New York Times reporter would tell me, get ready, we're sending a legion of reporters down here to cover her, back in 2018. So I watched her rise. I listened as Governor Kemp, even after his victory, joked that she had become more famous than him. She delivered the rebuttal to the State of the Union speech by Donald Trump. Chuck Schumer begged her to run for U.S. Senate seat, the seat that John Ossoff ended up winning. She sold out events, not only all over Georgia, but all over the nation. I went to one of her, a series of speeches she held. I went to the first one in Texas, in San Antonio. And I showed up, 10 minutes early, and I was astounded to see a packed audience in San Antonio, Texas. A big performance hall that was sold out to hear Stacey Abrams. So that's turned her into this figure with soaring name recognition, pretty much universal name recognition, with a huge fundraising list. She created an organization called Verified Action that basically was a political organization that helped promote the issues she was most invested in. And those are all the sort of positives for being this mythic figure, as you put it. But there's a lot of negatives too. And the biggest one is that it's easier for Republicans to paint her as this out-of-state funded, White House wannabe sort of thing. And that plays into Governor Kemp's arguments from way back in 2018 that he's continued. Early on, she went on a Star Trek spinoff and appeared as the president of Earth. And again, her fans loved it and her critics loved it too, because it played into exactly their vision of her. And the other thing you have to remember here too is that for the last 5 or 6 years, she has been the top target of Republicans here. So if you were running for county commissioner in rural Southeast Georgia as a Republican, you were running against Stacey Abrams. If you were running for dog catcher or coroner or whatever in the mountains of North Georgia, many of them were running against Stacey Abrams. And so that takes a toll as well, in a way that it didn't for Raphael Warnock, who was newer to the scene when he ran in 2020. So Stacey Abrams, she helped build that infrastructure. And I think as importantly, she also showed that Democrats can win, or at least come close to winning in Georgia, by appealing to the party's left. Her 2018 platform was, hey, we're not going to win by being Republican lights, by just having a few departure points from the GOP. We quibble on this issue or that issue, but we largely get along. And that's how some Democrats at least run their campaigns. It was conventional wisdom to do that. Supporting gun control measures, talking openly about same-sex marriage or preserving abortion rights was not something your typical statewide Democratic candidate did. And when she came onto the scene, she was talking about it and promoting it and putting money behind it. And it was shocking a lot of Democrats. And I think they were even more shocked that she came within a point and a half of beating Brian Kemp in that 2018 race. So she showed that, hey, you can organize, you can build a party from the grassroots and engage voters who usually skip midterms with this get out the vote machine. And you can also lean into liberal issues, which is exactly what she's doing in this campaign as well.
So we got to define liberal issues for our audience, because our last episode with Liz Smith, former press secretary for Mayor Pete, we were talking about, the progressive issues versus liberal issues. And we've already discussed abortion, and Stacey Abrams' second answer to you seems a little bit more conservative than you'd expect. And she was also out there pleading companies not to leave, telling them to calm down, protecting, tax credits. So when you're saying liberal issues, does she stake out a progressive position on the majority of issues, like whatever it may be, crime and guns and the other things? Or are these traditionally more center left, I don't want to say establishment, but establishment like liberal issues? Like, how would you characterize them?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say most liberal, maybe some progressive issues. I think that she embraced more progressive issues in 2018, really, when she went a little further when it came to criminal justice and guns. I mean, in 2018, she was often talking about no cash bail, and other criminal justice issues that were near and dear to her. Because she thinks the system is a number of just systemic failures, that even an 8-year process by the former Republican governor, Nathan Deal, to overhaul criminal justice in Georgia didn't go far enough in her view. So she's not staking out the same stance as she did in 2018, but a lot of her focus is on the revenue side, on the money, the spending side in the 2018, because in 2020, I should say, because Georgia now has a $6.6 billion surplus. And she says this is an opportunity for generational change, that you have this giant overflowing bank account essentially now that you can spend on programs that will bring all sorts of, long lasting change. You don't have to just go spend it on one thing or two things alone. You can go spend it on a whole bevy of things. Now, Governor Kemp says you can't, and that all that spending will force Georgia in the long run to raise taxes in order to sustain it. But She says that, A, she wouldn't raise taxes if she's elected. But B, you can go do this to expand Medicaid, which is something that she centered her 2018 campaign on, to raise teacher pay by a significant amount in some cases, $11,000 for some teachers, to set a floor of $50,000, to raise law enforcement pay, to fund tuition-free technical college for students, to give $1 billion back to a large group of Georgians, but not to the wealthiest. And one other major decision major policy she's put out, and there's a bunch. There's literally more than 100 policies she's issued. But one other big one would be legalizing casino gambling, which is another issue that Democratic statewide candidates have steered clear of because they don't want to go energize the Christian conservatives who feel gambling is a vice, even though polls show that a significant majority of Georgians are okay with legalizing gambling. She wants to do that to finance a needs-based college scholarship. So there's a number of policies that she's taken up this year. Some of them echo 2018, but some of them are brand new.
There's so much to say about Stacey Abrams and the governor's race. We're going to run out of time to talk about the Senate race, Greg, which is also this huge national story. I guess a good place to start as we kind of get back over to the Senate side of things is, talking about the difference between the Senate and the governor's race. When we look at the polls, we see, just like we were saying before, that Brian Kemp is running so far ahead of Herschel Walker, the two GOP nominees. And, in today's polarized environment, even when a candidate has as many flaws as Walker, which we're going to talk about, you still don't see that big of a gap on the ticket. So it suggests that there's a lot of these ticket splitters. And Greg, you're in touch with voters in Georgia. You're watching the race so closely. Who are these ticket splitters? Who is a Kemp Warnock voter? What's the profile of that person?
Yeah, and I talk to them all the time. And those are the Republican or Republican-leaning voters who just can't stomach a vote for Herschel Walker for some of the reasons we're about to talk about. But the first thing I'd say is Governor Kemp has a record. And so even some of the moderates who are sort of centrist voters who don't love his stance on abortion or guns or other kind of culture wars issues, at least a small but important segment of them are saying that they still like his stand on economy and the other parts of his record. And so they're willing to vote for him. So that helps juice his numbers a little bit beyond like the traditional Republican base. But you see, there's two main reasons that some of these split ticket voters say that they're voting for, they're withholding their support from Herschel Walker. One is Herschel Walker. He comes into this race. He lived in Texas for decades. He came into this race with a pattern of erratic behavior, of violence against women, including his ex-wife, bizarre statements, lies, exaggerations, falsehoods about his business record, his academic experience, and then strange things he said on the campaign trail, even before we get to the more recent abortion allegations that he pressured two ex-girlfriends into having abortions, even though he supports an outright ban on the procedure. He denies those accusations. But even before those surfaced in the last few weeks of the race, there was already significant doubts from a small but important block of voters about where he stood. And then on the flip side of it, you've got Senator Warnock, who is doing everything he can not to alienate that small but important segment of voters. You don't hear him going out there talking about Joe Biden, who is not a favorite of that small but significant block of voters. He is not talking about his work with Joe Biden. He's not welcoming Joe Biden with a red carpet to the state. He talks more about working with Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio than he does working with Joe Biden. And he talks about, a lot of these, certainly he has a liberal voting record. He votes with Joe Biden and he's the reason why a number of Joe Biden's priorities even are now law. But at the same time, he talks a lot about smaller bore issues like the $35 cap on insulin, like different ways to promote Georgia to expand Medicaid, which polls show is widely accepted here in Georgia. And when he talks about, he always brings this up on the campaign trail. One of the first things he says is, when I went up and gave a speech in support of a Ted Cruz proposal, and he looks at the room and there's always jaws dropping. He goes, yeah, I said that, Ted Cruz. And he talks about how he allied with Ted Cruz over an interstate project to expand the interstate from Texas to Georgia. So we're not talking about sweeping, overhauls of healthcare law or tax code or anything like that, but we're talking about an individual project that he feels like could better Georgia. When I asked him about Joe Biden, he gave that in the debate a few weeks ago, when a moderator asked him, will you endorse Joe Biden? He gave that sort of famous dodge. He was asked about it at a campaign event a couple of days ago. And he says, basically, Bluestein, it wasn't a dodge. He says, people keep on saying I'm dodging, but he rejects the premise of the question. He feels like it's political punditry. This is something he did back in 2020 as well. When I asked him on the debate stage if he supported expanding the Supreme Court, he said, that's a Washington question. I'm not going to answer it. Now, is it a Washington question? No, it's an important question that needs to be answered. And same thing as asking him if he's going to support, the sitting president of the party who became the first Democratic nominee to win Georgia since 1992. It's a valid question to ask him, but he gives this answer: who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out, who cares? He sees that as just a pundit question, and he feels like it's a distraction from the issues he wants to focus on.
Just to contrast the two, for anybody that's heard either of them speak, there couldn't be any two candidates that are more different, right? Warnock is this pastor who has 30 years of public speaking experience. He's amazing at it. He's like one of the top tier politicians. In Herschel Walker, there's, like you said, bevy of issues, but also concerns about his mental acuity. We've seen it in Pennsylvania, where folks are concerned about one of those candidates. And here with Herschel Walker, folks are at the national level. They're drawing a comparison and a bit concerned. Is that also being felt at the local level down in Georgia? Are folks at all concerned whether he is fit to do the job? And, he didn't even remember, supposedly, how many children he had, right? Obviously, I think he was lying, but is that being felt by the voters?
Yeah, I mean, that's the core of the Democratic argument right now, is that he's unfit to serve. Senator Warnock said at a rally with Obama a few days ago, you got to know stuff to do this job. That was one of those lines that instantly grabbed at me, because he hadn't really made that argument before in that way. But all of his TV ads basically, at least the attack ones, basically have that core message, which is that Herschel Walker's unfit for the job. Now, Herschel Walker would say, of course, otherwise, that his experience in the business world has helped prepare him for this job. But really, I talked to a number of supporters of his. Look, there's some people who are diehards, who love everything he does, who bring red and black jerseys to the events and want signature and take selfies with him and wait for hours to see him. Of course there are, right? But then there's a significant number of Republicans who know that, or who are really worried about his grasp of policy issues. We just did a poll that showed basically a majority, or at least or close to half of Georgians don't think that Herschel Walker's trustworthy. They have qualms about, misgivings about his grasp of policy issues and others. And yet a big group of them are still voting for him. And of course, it boils down to something you guys have, I'm sure, talked about on the show plenty, which is Republican control of the Senate. And now I'm not saying to all the Republicans, because there's plenty who just support him, period. But there's others who have very big concerns about him, but still are saying, we know he'll vote with Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell endorsed him early on in the cycle. He has Mitch McConnell's blessing. We know he'll vote with the GOP. He won't be some maverick. And so we're going to back him. And that to me is the reason why Herschel Walker, you're not seeing him in the high 30s or lower here in Georgia. A lot of people kept on predicting his campaign would collapse, but there's always that steady core of Republican voters. And he's not done, despite, even with all these misgivings and all these reports and all these damaging allegations, he has continued to basically send them the message that, hey, I'll vote Republican if I get elected. He's not given them any reason to believe that he'd stray away from the party line.
It's funny, Greg, because we were talking about this in the context of a different race, the one in Pennsylvania. We heard people reacting to the Lieutenant Governor Fetterman in the debate having problems with his, mental ability at that time. And we heard people saying, look, the most important thing is just that they show up to vote and they vote the right way. And me and Justin were talking about how there's so much more that a senator does, much more than just showing up to vote. They have to represent the state's interest during the negotiations of bills. They have to run the office. They have to set a good standard for constituent casework. And it leads us to a pretty interesting question here, which is how Walker ended up being the candidate, how he ended up clearing the field, because with Fetterman, these issues only became apparent at the very, very end of the primary after most of the campaigning had been done. And with Walker, it was there the whole time. he talked about how McConnell endorsed him early. And this seems really strange because McConnell has often objected to some of the nuttier candidates that have come out of GOP primary. So what's the story here? How did Walker end up being the nominee in the first place?
To answer briefly, and then I'll go into it, was I don't think McConnell felt like there was any chance they could oust him, right? And I'll tell you why, because Herschel Walker is not just an athlete. He's not just a star athlete. He is sort of that, I guess the word gets overused, but legendary. He is that sort of figure in Georgia history, in modern Georgia history, that transcends sports. And he is a cultural icon, or was, before he started running for Senate, because now he's alienated a big chunk of folks here. But before he ran for U.S. Senate, he was this cultural iconic figure. I just was talking about how Stacey Abrams had to fight for her universal name recognition. Herschel Walker hadn't lived here in decades, and he still had universal name recognition. I grew up in a family that parents, knew nothing about college football or football at all. And yet I grew up hearing stories of Herschel Walker. I have Democratic friends whose dogs are named Herschel because he's so intrinsically tied to the University of Georgia, and beyond that, really to the state. So he comes in there with this soaring name recognition before he even, basically as soon as his name starts getting whispered in political circles here that he could run, Donald Trump sends out an email blast saying that Herschel Walker would be unstoppable if he ran. And this was in early 2021, maybe it was February. So immediately, and this tells you the Herschel Walker appeal here, immediately it froze the field, that email. Not just because it was Trump, because it involved Herschel Walker. And very good potential statewide candidates basically said, hey, I can't run against Herschel Walker. The Attorney General, Chris Carr, who's leading in the polls in a re-election bid right now over a very strong Democratic candidate, he said that. Congressman Buddy Carter was thinking about running, even filmed ads and said, you know what, I can't run against Herschel Walker. Another Congressman, Drew Ferguson, was rumored to be a really top contender and would have all sorts of money come in. He made the same calculus. And then a lot of former Senator David Perdue, former Senator Kelly Loeffler, other kind of, big names from outside politics, they all said, you know what, we can't mess with Herschel Walker. And the one big name who did, or semi-big name, was the Agriculture Commissioner, Gary Black, who had won 3 statewide elections, who'd won millions of votes. And so he felt like he had a strong chance against Herschel Walker and didn't even come close in the Republican primary. Herschel Walker was so in command that he didn't even utter his opponent's name. He didn't go to any debates, forums with them, nothing. And he didn't even mention Gary Black or any of the other opponents' name once. He was always that confident of victory in the primary.
So, Greg, I wanted to add my father, rest in peace, but he served it down in Fort Benning, Georgia, getting ready for the Vietnam War and his ship off. And he then lived a little bit in Georgia, I want to say in Savannah, in the 80s. And he told me this story as a child. Mind you, I'm a Yankee. I'm from New Hampshire. And it was about this amazing athlete from Georgia named Herschel Walker, who I doubt this is even true, but this is the myth of Herschel Walker, who at one point my dad saw him running down the street with his shirt off and he just looked like a Greek Adonis. And there was a car on fire and Herschel Walker ripped off the door and saved this woman and a crying baby. And Greg, he told me it's one of the few stories I remember about athletes from my father. And I was a college baseball player. So that is just to underscore the mythic proportions that Herschel Walker has reached for his, athleticism. Even up in the cold winters of New Hampshire, we were regaling stories of Herschel Walker. So I just wanted to add that one in there.
At one of his first public events, like big public events, I saw grown men and really wealthy grown men just trip over themselves, just trying to be within, a 50-foot orbit of Herschel Walker, jump fences and do all sorts of degrading things just to try to be somewhere close to him. And, I've seen Democrats go to his rallies with, kind of Georgia hats and kind of keep their bill low just so that, in case they're recognized, because they want an autograph from him or they want a picture with him to this day, right? Even with all the polarizing things that have come out during this campaign.
And that's what makes sports just so great as the World Series going on, as you're getting ready to go to one of the biggest regular season college football games in history of the sport. It can unite people in a way where you're going to be sitting next to Republicans and Democrats and you're a journalist and you're all going to be going nuts when Uga scores a touchdown, right?
when I don't think Uga, the mascot, will be scoring a touchdown, but when some bulldog scores a touchdown, you're exactly right.
I think that we underestimate these athlete politicians at our peril. In Pakistan, they had Imran Khan, the huge cricket star, as their PM until recently. And then in Liberia, they've got George Weah, the global football star, as their president. So, who knows where Walker would stop if he ends up winning this race.
Or if he could string a sentence together.
You never know. You never count anything out
yeah.
in U.S. politics these days.
I want to ask one last question about the Senate race. So we have heard a lot of praise for folks like Tim Ryan, and we've heard praise from the way that they run their campaigns. They're going statewide. They're doing the Chuck Grassley, right, in Iowa. They're going to every county. They're going into deep red areas because instead of losing 80-20, if they lose 70-30, they're making these inroads that you referenced way earlier in our discussion about what Brian Kemp is doing. And also, they're willing to go on different media channels. Like Tim Ryan went on, for example, Fox News, which is anathema to a lot of Democrats. They're going into the lion's den. So this is a loaded two-part question, but are we seeing the same statewide efforts from Senator Warnock and Senator Walker to go to all of these areas? And then the second part will be about media, I'll ask.
Yeah, I mean, first you've seen, I think we've seen it more in the governor's race with Stacey Abrams going to deep red areas where to try to cut those margins. But you've certainly seen Senator Warnock do as well. He'll go to some very off the beaten path areas. Just the other day, he went to a little town in Southeast Georgia called Waycross, and that's where his mother's from. He always says she comes from Waycross, Georgia, but it's not a Democratic stronghold by any means. But no, so we're definitely seeing that play out as a strategy in these races. Are you seeing Herschel Walker aim at Democratic audience? Much no. Herschel Walker's main challenge right now is energizing the party's base. Governor Kemp, polls show him with 95% of GOP support. Polls show Herschel Walker with in the 80s. He needs to be closer to the 90s. He needs to be where Brian Kemp is to have a chance of an outright victory. And so he'll be at gun ranges in middle Georgia. He'll be in the mountains of North Georgia. He'll be in small rural towns where he'll get huge crowds. He's getting big crowds pretty much everywhere he goes. But is he going to is he focusing primarily on the Atlanta suburbs where there's tons of voters, but not as much support? Not as much, right? He's having a few events in the suburbs, but primarily, especially in the weeks before this final stretch, he was in smaller towns where that lean really red.
Well, that's quite a lesson for any Republican candidates who might be listening to this episode. You can be at 95% approval among Republicans in a competitive state while being on the wrong side of Trump. Wow, maybe some more should try it.
Yes.
One last question for you. And, we need to ask you about this because, we're doing interviews, we're preparing questions, and you were a debate moderator. And we want to ask you about how you approach that process. How do you figure out what questions to ask? How do you prepare yourself to moderate a debate?
Well, a couple of things. You always want to be over-prepared because you never know how quickly these debates go. I've done a number of different debates. Some formats, I'll get 8, 9, 10 questions and even more sometimes. Other formats, I'm not kidding. I usually, there's one certain debate, I only get one. Or maybe 2 if you're really lucky. And that's because that format encourages clashing, which is fine. I like the clash. So I'm totally cool with that. But we like to go into these debates with a strategy as well. We know that some of the questions that reporters on the press corps have heard the answers before, but there's a value in making sure 1 million or 2 million other people who don't know everything that we've written before, or every stance that has been uttered by these candidates also hear it. And you never know. The other day in the Governor Kemp, Stacey Abrams debate, Kemp was asked for the umpteenth time, does he support more abortion restrictions? And he gave a slightly different answer where he wouldn't commit to a position on whether he'd signed those new abortion laws, any new abortion restrictions into law. So that was definitely news in that stance. And the other thing you want to do is you want to make sure you cover the big topics. So, in Georgia, it's healthcare, it's abortion, it's guns, it's public safety, it's the economy, education. So we devise questions to at least tackle those big issues. And then in doing the primary, there was one debate that I was handling. I was a panelist on where it was the third of the debates between Brian Kemp and David Perdue. And the first 2 had been dominated by election fraud lies, by David Perdue promoting all these election fraud lies. So we kind of went in there and saying, hey, folks have heard that. Let's talk about other issues. And it didn't give David Perdue the venue he wanted to continue hammering about Donald Trump's election fraud lies. But I thought it was a more substantive debate because you needed to do that in this first debate, maybe even the second one. But the third one, you don't need to hammer those same points all over again. So it also depends on where you are in the debate regimen. And that helps dictate your strategy.
Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you very much, listeners, for stepping in and listening to this show. Next show will be this coming Friday, where Mr. John Gunnison and I will be reviewing the midterms. What does it all mean? Who won? Potentially, how did they win in certain races? And how will this influence U.S. politics moving forward for the next 2 years? So until Friday morning, we will see you next time.